"Why are your eyes so quiet, mister? Like a candle that ran out of wax." Graham Vale froze in his leather chair. The glow of his laptop reflecting off a dining room meant for 12, yet set for 1. In his mansion overlooking the city, he ate every night in silence, a billionaire health executive with a terminal diagnosis hidden in a locked drawer. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. 4 months, maybe less. He told no one, because there was no one to tell. Then, on an ordinary Friday, the front door opened to something that didn't belong in a house like his, a shy cleaner named Lena Ortiz, and her 3-year-old daughter, Mia. The daycare had closed, Lena had no family nearby, and missing her first day meant losing everything. Graham barely looked up until he heard it, a child's laugh bouncing off marble like sunlight in a vault. Mia wandered into his office days later, eyes wide and fearless. "You're sad," she said, as if naming the weather. The words hit harder than any diagnosis. Soon she left drawings on his desk, stick figures holding hands, and somehow Graham found himself waiting for her tiny footsteps in the hallway. He bought strawberries by accident, left his door cracked open by chance. And one night, for the first time in years, he didn't eat alone. When his brother Derek Vale stormed in, accusing Lena of gold digging, Lena disappeared out of pride, out of fear. But Graham found her in the rain, trembling at a bus stop, and confessed the truth. "I don't need my money. I need my time. Let me be her dad while I still can." Mia reached for him and whispered, "Can you?" And for the first time, Graham felt alive enough to say, yes. The house had everything: Italian marble floors, museum-worthy art, a heated pool no one had ever touched, and yet it breathed like a mausoleum. Graham Vale moved through it like a shadow, careful not to disturb the silence he had perfected over decades. The hallways were too long. The rooms were too large. Every echo reminded him that success had given him space, but taken away warmth. Each morning he swallowed pills meant to slow the inevitable, then put on a suit as if control still belonged to him. Chemotherapy left his hands shaking, his skin pale, his appetite gone, but he still went to the office, still signed papers, still pretended the future existed. Work had always been his shield. As long as numbers moved and contracts closed, he didn't have to feel the hollow ache spreading through his chest. The only constant presence was Mrs. Caldwell, his longtime housekeeper. Efficient, quiet, professional. They exchanged no more than a handful of words a day, just enough to function, never enough to connect. Graham liked it that way. No questions, no sympathy. No reminders that he was dying alone. At night he sat at the far end of the dining table cutting steak he couldn't taste, staring at 11 empty chairs like unanswered questions. He couldn't remember when laughter had last filled this room, or when someone had asked how his day was and actually waited for the answer. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a monument to everything he had sacrificed. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the cold porcelain plate, Graham realized a truth more terrifying than cancer. He hadn't just postponed living. He had erased it. He didn't know it yet. But the silence he clung to was about to be broken by small footsteps, crayon drawings, and a voice brave enough to ask what no one else ever had. The disruption began quietly, almost politely, like a crack forming in a wall no one had touched in years. On a Thursday morning, Mrs. Caldwell stood in Graham's office, hands folded, voice unsteady for the first time in 15 years. An accident, a twisted ankle, 2 weeks of rest. Graham nodded without emotion and waved the matter away. A temporary replacement would be arranged. It meant nothing to him. He didn't know that by saying yes, he had opened the door to the only thing that could still save him. The next morning, Graham heard unfamiliar voices echo through the mansion. One nervous, one impossibly small. He ignored them at first, buried himself in spreadsheets that no longer mattered until the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the hallway. Real coffee. Warm. Alive. Then came the sound that stopped him cold. A laugh. High-pitched, unfiltered, completely out of place. He followed it to the kitchen and found Lena Ortiz standing stiffly at the sink, and beside her on the floor, a tiny girl in a faded pink dress humming to a doll made of cloth and buttons. Mia looked up at him without fear, her eyes wide and curious, as if she were studying a puzzle instead of a man. Lena panicked, apologized too fast, explained the closed daycare, the lack of options, the desperation of needing the job. Graham listened in silence, ready to dismiss them both until Mia tilted her head and said simply, "You look sad." The words landed heavier than any prognosis. Graham turned away and muttered that they could stay as long as there was no mess. But behind him, Mia whispered to her mother, "He's not scary. He's just empty." And in that moment, though Graham didn't know it yet, the silence he had built his life around had begun to crumble, one small voice at a time. Mia didn't belong to the mansion, and that was precisely why she changed it. Her laughter echoed down marble corridors that had never learned the sound bouncing off walls, built to impress, not to hold joy. She sat on the kitchen floor, with her paper and broken crayons, drawing suns that were too big, and people holding hands that Graham Vale had never imagined himself part of. Every line she drew felt like a quiet rebellion against the stillness he worshipped. One afternoon, when Lena was upstairs scrubbing bathrooms, Mia wandered down the long hallway, her small footsteps barely making a sound. Graham sat in his office, staring past numbers on a screen, lost in thoughts of pain creeping back into his bones and time slipping through his fingers. He didn't hear her until she spoke. "Hi." He looked up, startled. She stood there with her hands behind her back, head tilted, studying him with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone so small. Before he could ask her to leave, she said it again, softly, but certain. "You're sad." Graham denied it out of habit, but Mia shook her head. "Your eyes are dim," she said, "like a candle when the wax is gone." The words pierced him. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. No adult had ever dared to say that to him. The next day she brought him a drawing. A crooked house. A tiny girl. A woman. And a man standing alone to the side. "That's you," Mia said, "because you live alone. But I saw you." Graham stared at the paper, his hands trembling, and quietly placed it in the same drawer as his medical reports, life resting beside death. From that day on, the mansion changed. Graham began leaving his door open. He waited for her footsteps. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir, fragile, terrifying, and alive. Something subtle shifted after that drawing, like a clock changing its rhythm without making a sound. Graham didn't announce the change. He didn't even admit it to himself. But he stopped closing his office door. He began leaving a bowl of fruit on the corner of his desk. Strawberries, grapes, the small, sweet things Mia liked. When he heard her footsteps in the hallway, he no longer tensed. He waited. Mia grew braver. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, humming while she colored, asking questions that slipped past his defenses. "Why is your house so big? Why don't you have pictures on the walls? Why don't you smile?" Graham answered some, avoided others, but he never told her to leave. And that alone felt like a confession. One afternoon, she tugged on his sleeve while Lena folded laundry nearby. "Do you eat alone every day?" she asked. Graham nodded. "That's sad," Mia said, not accusing, just stating a fact. The word lingered between them. That night, without planning it, Graham found himself sitting at the table with Lena and Mia. No silver covers, no crystal silence, just rice beans and the sound of a child's feet swinging under the chair. As they ate, Mia looked up at him with her mouth full. "You always chose work," she said, echoing words she didn't fully understand. Then she tilted her head. Do you still choose? The question struck harder than pain ever had. Graham realized that somewhere along the way, choosing had stopped. Life had narrowed into habit, then, into waiting. And yet here he was, laughing softly, tasting food, feeling the warmth of people beside him. For the first time in years, Graham Vale wasn't counting time. He was inside it. The world outside the mansion felt unreal at first, as if Graham had stepped into a life meant for someone else. Sunlight spilled through the trees at the park. Children ran past with sticky fingers and loud laughter, and somewhere nearby, a street musician played a song Graham almost recognized. Almost. Mia's hand was warm and small in his, gripping tightly, as if she were afraid he might disappear. Come on, she urged, pulling him toward the swings. You have to push me. Graham hesitated. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced hostile boards, signed papers that changed thousands of lives, but this felt harder. He didn't know how much strength to use, didn't know the rhythm, didn't know how to be this man. Lena started to step forward, sensing his uncertainty. I've got it, Graham said, surprising them both. He placed his hands on Mia's back and pushed gently. The swing moved. Mia laughed, sharp, wild, unfiltered, and something inside Graham cracked wide open. He pushed again, and again. With every burst of laughter, the weight in his chest loosened. Then, without realizing when it happened, Graham laughed too. Not the polite smile he used in meetings, but a real laugh, loud, shaky, alive. Lena watched from a bench, tears blurring her vision. The man who once moved through life like a ghost was kneeling in the dirt, clapping as Mia soared higher, as if nothing in the world mattered more. Later, they sat at a tiny plastic table at a neighborhood ice cream shop. Mia's face was smeared with strawberry pink. Lena held her cone carefully. Graham chose chocolate, breaking rules he'd enforced on himself for decades. Mia looked up at him and asked, Are you happy today? He paused. The answer mattered. I think I am, he said honestly. That night, pain returned, as it always did, dull and relentless. But so did something new, an unfamiliar desire to wake up tomorrow. Graham lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing the truth at last. Joy hadn't cured him. It had done something braver. It had reminded him how to live while there was still time. The truth came out on a quiet evening, the kind that feels heavier than it should. Mia was asleep on the couch, curled around her cloth doll, while Lena washed dishes in the kitchen. Graham sat across from her at the table, his face pale, his hands folded too tightly, as if holding himself together took effort. I need to tell you something, he said. Lena looked up immediately. She had learned to read the pauses in his voice, the moments when he went still. Graham didn't dress it up. He never had. I'm sick, he said. Terminal. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The words fell into the room and stayed there. Lena's breath caught. How long, she whispered. 4 months? Maybe less. He looked down. I've already used most of them. Silence followed, thick, aching, alive. Lena covered her mouth, tears slipping down before she could stop them. Why didn't you tell us, she asked, not accusing, just broken. Because before you and Mia, there was no us. Graham answered. There was no one to tell. He expected fear, distance, pity. Instead, Lena stood and crossed the room in 2 steps. She wrapped her arms around him without asking, without hesitation. Graham stiffened at first, then collapsed into her shoulder, sobbing quietly, years of restraint breaking loose all at once. I don't care how much time you have, Lena whispered. I care that you're not alone for it. Mia stirred on the couch and mumbled his name in her sleep. Graham closed his eyes, breathing her in, feeling something settle into place. He finally said it out loud, the truth that had been growing inside him. Then stay, he said. Both of you. Let me be here. Let me be something more. Lena pulled back just enough to look at him. We already are, she said softly. And for the first time since his diagnosis, Graham Vale didn't feel like he was dying. He felt chosen. The fracture came without warning, sharp and merciless. One afternoon, the front door opened with authority instead of hesitation, and Derek Vale stepped into the mansion like a verdict. His tailored suit was immaculate, his eyes already measuring, already judging. He barely noticed Mia on the floor with her puzzle, or Lena in the kitchen, brewing coffee that smelled like home. His gaze locked on Graham. "What is this?" Derek demanded. "A nanny. A charity project." Graham rose slowly, pain flaring in his side. "They live here," he said. "That's all you need to know." Derek laughed, cold and precise. "You're dying," he snapped. "And suddenly there's a woman and a child in your house. Don't be naive." She saw an opportunity. His words cut deeper than he knew. "She brings her cute little girl, cooks warm meals, plays family, and you fall for it." Graham shouted for him to leave. The walls seemed to shake, but the damage was already done. Lena had heard everything. That night, she packed in silence. No confrontation, no defense, only dignity. She wrote a letter with shaking hands, thanking Graham for his kindness, apologizing for the trouble, promising she never wanted anything but work and safety for her child. When Graham found it on the kitchen table the next morning, panic clawed through him like fire. She was gone. Days passed in agony. Graham searched, calling numbers, visiting addresses, wasting precious strength he didn't have. Then one rainy afternoon he saw her at a bus stop, shielding Mia with a plastic bag. He stopped the car in the street rain, soaking his suit as he ran to them. "I don't care what he said," Graham pleaded. "I'm dying and you're the only real thing I have." Mia reached for him, arms open. "Don't go," she whispered. And in that moment, Graham knew this wasn't charity. It was family. The days that followed felt borrowed, fragile, and impossibly bright. Lena and Mia moved back into the mansion a week later, not as guests, but as something unspoken, yet undeniable. Graham converted a spare bedroom into Mia's room, soft pink walls, shelves, filled with books, stuffed animals arranged with care he never knew he had. When Mia stood in the doorway, eyes wide, and asked, "Is this really mine?" Graham nodded, his throat tight. "It's yours." She wrapped her arms around his legs and whispered the word that changed everything. "Thank you, Dad." Those months became the most intense of Graham Vale's life. Not because the pain eased, it didn't, but because meaning finally arrived. He took Mia to the zoo, lifting her so she could see the giraffes up close. He sat through children's plays, clapping too loudly, laughing too freely. He taught Lena how to drive, patient and gentle, celebrating every clumsy gear change like a victory. They ate dinner together every night, no matter how tired he was, because the table no longer felt like a graveyard of empty chairs. When the pain grew unbearable, Graham was admitted to his own hospital. The irony didn't escape him. Lena slept in a chair beside his bed. Mia taped crayon drawings to the wall, Sonny Park's 3 stick figures holding hands. Even Derek came once, standing quietly, understanding too late. In his final week, Graham rewrote his will. He left his wealth behind, but his real legacy was simpler. He held Lena's hand. He felt Mia's fingers wrapped around his. And when the end came on a quiet Sunday morning with sunlight spilling through the window, Graham Vale didn't leave this world as a lonely man. He left as a father. After Graham Vale was gone, the house did not fall silent again. It changed its voice. Laughter echoed more softly now, but it was real. The dining table no longer waited for 12. It welcomed 3 memories and 1 empty chair that still felt warm. Lena kept the lights on in the evenings, not because she was afraid of the dark, but because Graham had once said he liked knowing someone was awake. Weeks later, Lena read the letter Graham had written for Mia. her hands trembling as she followed his careful handwriting. "You saved me," it said. "Long before the doctor said I was dying, I already was. I just didn't know it until you asked me why I was sad." Mia didn't understand every word, but she understood the feeling. She pressed the paper to her chest and whispered goodnight to his photograph, the only one where he was smiling wide, unguarded, alive. Life moved forward slowly and imperfectly. 2 years later, Lena opened a small cafe not far from the old mansion. She named it Ember because Graham once said that even the smallest flame could keep someone warm. Mia helped wipe tables after school, proudly telling customers, "My dad taught me how to be brave." And in a quiet corner of the cafe hung that same drawing, the crooked house, the 3 figures holding hands framed like a masterpiece. Graham had built hospitals, wealth, and an empire. But in the end, his greatest legacy was simpler and far more fragile. 4 months of love, a child who felt chosen, and a woman who learned that family can arrive without warning. The story leaves behind one question lingering like a heartbeat in silence. How many of us are waiting for someday to choose love, when all it really takes is being present right now? The lesson Graham left behind did not arrive as advice or warning. It lived quietly in the lives he touched, in the way Lena no longer apologized for taking up space, in the way Mia slept each night, knowing she was chosen, not abandoned. Graham's story was never about dying. It was about waking up. For most of his life, Graham believed meaning was something you earned later, after the company was stable, after the next deal, after success finally slowed down. But life never waits for the calendar to clear. It waits for courage. And courage he learned too late, and just in time, is choosing people over pride, presence over protection, love over control. He didn't have decades to change. He had months. And yet those months were enough to rewrite an entire life. Enough to prove that love doesn't measure time. In years, it measures it in moments fully lived. A hand held in a hospital room. Laughter on a playground swing. A child calling you dad without hesitation. Graham once built hospitals that saved thousands of strangers. But in the end, it was a 3-year-old girl who saved him. Not with medicine, not with miracles, but with a question so simple it cut through a lifetime of noise. Why are you sad? That question remains for all of us. How many dinners do we eat, distracted, waiting for a future that never arrives? How many embraces do we postpone because we're too busy? How many chances at connection do we dismiss, believing there will always be more time? Graham's life reminds us of a quiet truth we often forget. Love doesn't need perfection. It doesn't need permission. And it doesn't wait. It arrives when we finally stop running and choose to sit down at the table, look across at another human being, and stay. Time passed gently but unmistakably, and Graham Vale's absence settled into the world like a quiet truth. He did not leave behind headlines or monuments bearing his name. What remained was smaller and infinitely heavier. A little girl who no longer asked why people leave, a woman who no longer doubted her worth, a love that had arrived too late to be long yet early enough to matter. Graham had once believed legacy was built in boardrooms, contracts, and buildings that scraped the sky. But in his final understanding, legacy lived elsewhere, in bedtime routines, in shared meals, in the certainty of belonging. He left Mia not just money or security, but something rarer, the memory of being chosen, of being held, of being loved without condition. That was the inheritance that could never be spent. Lena carried his story forward quietly, not as tragedy, but as proof. Proof that life can change in a season, that even a heart hardened by decades of isolation can soften, that redemption does not require a lifetime-only honesty presence and the courage to let someone in. Graham had 4 months of family. 4 months of laughter, of scraped knees and melted ice cream of hands held in hospital rooms and small fingers wrapped around his own. And those 4 months outweighed 50 years of success, lived alone. In the end, he did not conquer death. He did something far braver. He met it as a man who had finally lived. And his story leaves us with a final quiet reminder that love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it is felt and how fully we allow it to change us before time runs out. Years later, the story of Graham Vale no longer sounded like a tragedy. It sounded like a beginning that arrived late, but burned bright. The cafe Lena opened carried his name quietly, not as a shrine, but as a continuation. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the windows onto wooden tables, worn smooth by use by elbows, resting by conversations lingering longer than planned. It was the kind of place Graham would have once ignored and later would have loved. Mia grew there. She learned to count by stacking sugar packets, learned kindness by watching her mother greet strangers with patience, learned courage by remembering a man who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. On the wall hung one photograph, Graham at the park, laughing eyes alive, holding her like she was the center of the world. Customers sometimes asked who he was. Mia always answered the same way. "That's my dad. He taught me how to live." Graham's wealth had built hospitals, yes, but those were no longer the measure of his life. His real legacy lived in smaller places, in a child who felt safe at night, in a woman who no longer felt invisible, in a community warmed by a story they never witnessed, but somehow felt. Love had rippled outward long after he was gone, and that is the quiet miracle of his story. Not that death was defeated, but that meaning was reclaimed. Not that time was extended, but that it was finally used. Graham Vale did not leave behind more time. He left behind more life, and perhaps that is all any of us are truly meant to do. In the end, Graham Vale's story was never about money illness or even loss. It was about timing and the quiet tragedy of realizing too late what truly matters. He spent a lifetime building hospitals, saving lives he would never meet, yet nearly lost his own before a 3-year-old girl asked a question no adult ever dared to ask. "Why are you sad?" That question cracked open everything. Graham learned that love doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It doesn't arrive when the calendar clears or when success feels complete. It shows up unannounced, messy, inconvenient, and honest. A child's laughter in a silent mansion. A shared meal replacing years of empty dinners. Hands held not because there was time, but because there wasn't. He had only 4 months of family. 4 months to learn how to laugh freely, how to sit still, how to be needed not for his wealth, but for his presence. And those 4 months outweighed decades of achievement lived alone. Because for the first time, Graham wasn't preparing for life later. He was living it now. When he died, he didn't leave behind regret. He left behind warmth. A woman who knew her worth. A child who knew she was chosen. Proof that even at the very end, it is never too late to choose love. This story reminds us of a hard truth. Success without connection is just a quieter kind of loneliness. We delay hugs. We postpone dinners. We tell ourselves later as if time is guaranteed. But love doesn't need more time. It needs presence. One honest question. One shared meal. One moment where you choose people over pride. Don't wait until life forces you to stop. Stop now and choose love. Would you have made the same choice as Graham? Who in your life deserves more of your presence today? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more powerful human stories that remind us what truly matters. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs the reminder. It's not too late.